Good morning, guys. We're back at it again. Where have I been? What have I been doing? It's been 3 months since I posted a video. Well, oh well. My, oh my. This house build has definitely been one of the most difficult things that I've done physically and especially mentally. So by the time that we're able to move in and actually live in this space and get out of the tiny house, I immensely needed a break from construction, from making videos, and a lot of time I just needed to get things in my life in order that I was kind of pushing away. Like, for example, towards the end of the house build, I've had some structural issues with my body for probably, I don't know, at least the last 5, 6, 7 years. So I was doing a lot of construction while I was under a considerable amount of pain in my lower back, in my upper back, in my rhomboids. So I just needed time to take a break, get my life in order. So that's because I was just kind of miserable by the end of it. I'm like, I just wanted it to get everything done, to get living in here. The tiny house was, becoming stressful after living in there for over 4 years. But I wanted to make this video today talking specifically about how all this happened. And we're going to dive deep and we're going to go back in history. I'm going to do a number of videos kind of sitting down and chatting like this. One especially talking about, things that I would do differently on the house, things that I'm glad that I did. And I'm also going to do a full house tour. So when everything is 100% done, I'm just waiting on some wooden shelves to be fabricated for us. Once that is all done, and I get everything installed, then we'll do a final video so that you guys can see and really appreciate what this house was, or what this house is, and all the time and effort and care that went into it in creating just this epic space. A space that I wanted to obviously create for Hannah and myself, but also to be able to have friends and family and guests over, and for them to feel like, man, this is like a great space. The energy in here is fantastic. But to get to this point, I don't think a lot of people exactly know the full story. And I've seen some messages and comments and stuff where people think that, oh, you're just like rich kids and you got an inheritance and this is how you're able to do this. And it's probably one of the furthest things from the truth. So I think by the end of this video, I'll try to keep things relatively brief and concise and not go into too much detail about things. But I think by the end of it, you're going to have an appreciation for what we've done and what we've been able to accomplish in our life, and especially for me over the last 10 years, how my life has dramatically changed. And I'm going to weave a lot of the lessons that I learned and talk about any resources that I used to get to this point. Because for me, I've had a lot of time to think while I've been working on this house. I spent a lot of time with myself working on different aspects of it. So I'm able to just kind of think about things. And one thing that I think is really important to talk about is, on the subtitle of this YouTube channel, I have Escape the Rat Race and Build a Meaningful Life. And I think showing construction and showing how I'm doing things, I enjoy doing that to a certain extent. But there's a lot more behind the scenes. There's a lot more that, I haven't really talked about in great depth or great detail on this channel. And I would say that that's just more of my fault. And maybe it's more fear-based or something like that. Maybe it's like I don't want to share other aspects of my life. But I think I'm at a point where I want to share a lot more. And I want this channel to be a place where you can come and get inspiration, where you can also have some actionable steps, so that if you want to replicate what we've done in any kind of way, or to create a life that you are just wanting to have, then I think I can help lead you in the right direction. Not like in a guru sense, like you got to do what I do, but I like to think of it more along the lines of, say, for example, you went on a hike and you had a guide on the hike. It's not like the hiking guide is going to take all these steps for you. They might say, hey, maybe try this direction, or hey, maybe you have to look out for this. So I just want to talk about stories. I love telling stories about how things have come to fruition, because especially when you look back at things in life, I think it's a Steve Jobs quote where he says, you can't really connect the dots looking forward, but when you get to a certain place in your life, you can look back and then connect the dots. And I want to connect those dots for you so that you understand how all this came to be. And I want you to understand it's like I operate from the premise that anything that you want in your life that you sincerely desire and truly want, you can make happen. And I've been believing that premise and working with that idea for over the last 10 years. And I think I've been doing a relatively pretty damn good job of it, of creating an unconventional life for myself and not really following how people typically do things. So let's get into a little bit of history about myself, where I came from, where I started in life, and work our way back to basically where we are right now. So for those of you that know, you know that I grew up in Canada. I'm a Canadian. I'm a Canuck. I grew up in a small town, not like super small, but it's about 360,000 people in Ontario, called London. So whenever I say that I'm from London, people think that I'm from England, and I'm like, well, I don't really have an accent, but I grew up in London, Ontario. Very humble beginnings. You know, my parents aren't super wealthy or anything like that. You know, we're probably lower to middle class, I would say. And that's where my life started, in London. That's where I was born. That's where I lived for the first 25 years of my life. And then when I was 25, that's when I finally left the nest. So when I was born, something that was, very interesting to me, and something that I think I've overcome quite a bit in my life, is that when I was born, doctors, I did not speak. So I made sounds, but up until the age of 3, I did not speak words. I mainly just said, ee, ee. And so when my parents would take me to the doctor, and they're kind of noticing how I'm not developing, language, and I'm not developing the way that other kids would develop, the doctor thought I was retarded, like literally retarded. And thinking back, I'm like, man, what a terrible thing to imprint onto a child's mind, especially when you kind of see where things are at now in my life. Like, I'm definitely not a retard by any stretch of the imagination, but my parents were not deductive to that. So they didn't believe that I was retarded or anything. They just thought that I was just developing slower. And they knew that I wasn't a stupid kid or anything like that, because while I couldn't speak, I was reacting and I was understanding what they were saying, but I just didn't have any words. And I even remember from a young age going to speech therapy classes at a local hospital with my mom, probably when I was, 4 or 5 years old. So even before I got into school. And so I definitely have troubles actually saying certain sounds at times, like S sounds. We always had to work on S sounds. So if you're like, why do you pronounce things in a weird way? It's because I had a speech impediment for definitely the early part of my life. And that's, it's crazy to think, but it's just, the cards that you're dealt. Everyone is going to have a different set of cards, or different hands that they're dealt in life. And we have to make do with what we have. And that's, a part of my life. It's funny to think, it's like now I've done in-person talks in front of 200 or 300 people, or even smaller groups, where I actually enjoy being on stage and I actually get a thrill out of it. Whereas when I was younger, I couldn't really even speak. So I grew up in London, Ontario. Going through school, I was a brown noser. So I was, smart in math and science and anything in that regard. I was very good at learning what the teacher would say and being able to replicate it on a test. So that's why I was really good in school, and I got really good grades. And I was known as a brown noser. And I was also known as a brown noser because I wasn't rebellious. I was well behaved in school, teacher's pet, so to speak. And that's kind of my upbringing through school. Now, one thing that I especially learned about myself is that I had a lot of belief in myself, that I was smart. So those ideas and imprints that people put on, I was like, I had confidence in myself because I knew that I could figure things out. And this started from a very young age, and that has obviously taken me to where I am now. I have a lot of belief in myself in that I may not know exactly how things are going to happen, but I know that I'm going to figure out a way to do it. So I also did really well in high school. My average through high school was always either in the low 90s or the high 80s. So for a lot of people that are watching that are probably American, you might be like, what do you mean? It's like 90% out of 100%. So I was always either an A or A plus student. And I don't have any regrets with that or anything. It's just, that's just what I was good at. I was good at regurgitating the information that the teachers said and being able to apply it on a test. I very rarely had to actually study for tests until I got into university, and I realized I'm like, oh, you actually have to study this stuff and understand it. You just can't really realistically either study the night before or try to figure out things while I'm taking the test, because that's how I actually did a lot of my tests. Like I wouldn't have to study, and so I would actually figure out what the teacher was trying to want us to put down on the test or whatever it is. And in certain like math problems, I could figure out the patterns and how to do it without even having to study. So I was known as a brown noser, known as a smart kid, and that was very much ingrained into my psyche. And so my parents, wanted me to obviously do post-secondary education. So I definitely, my mind works in a very mechanical sense. So in an analytical sense. So, and you can obviously judge by a lot of the projects that I've done. Like I think things through, I'm very meticulous with things. And that's something that I've kind of always taken with me, is that self-belief and that belief in myself that I can do whatever I need to do and I can figure it out. And that is something I think my parents imprinted in me, my teachers imprinted me. I think it's also very interesting to look back at your life and to start to think, what were the beliefs that my circle, right? Your family, your parents, your siblings, your cousins, your aunts, your uncles, the people that you that you spent a lot of time with growing up. It's like, what ideas did they implant on my mind? And are these ideas, are they useful for me now? Can I change these ideas? And change these beliefs that I may have about myself. I've always been very also entrepreneurial minded. I can remember back when I was younger, because, my parents didn't have a lot of money. So if my brother and I, if we wanted something, we had to go out and make the money to do it. I can remember, I played a lot of hockey growing up too, competitive hockey, and I did a lot of timekeeping. So timekeeping is the guy that sits in the box and, changes the scoreboard and, stuff like that. And, even at a very young age, I was, paid $10 an hour. And this is when minimum wage for where I grew up was like $5 or $6 an hour. So for me, it was amazing, right? I could go timekeep 3 or 4 games and make like 30 or 40 bucks. And then I was like, wow, I got all this money, so I can go, buy stuff or do things that I wanted to do. One of the first really kind of interesting things that my brother and I did is that we're obviously into like video games. Our original system was just the original Nintendo. Then we got a Super Nintendo, and then we got into the PlayStation. So we really wanted a PlayStation, and this was back in the day when at Blockbuster, you could actually rent a console. So you could rent a PlayStation for a weekend or something like that and get some games with it. But we wanted our own PlayStation. So we cut grass an entire summer in order to make, I think it was like $200 or $300 in order to make the money so that we could buy a PlayStation. And I've always been into things like that, just trying to figure out different ways of making money. And I've always really appreciated that because I've never had like handouts like that. Yes, my parents always provided me with a nice home to live in and food. But if I wanted anything else, I had to go out and do it myself. It wasn't something that was going to be given to me. I got my first job at 15 years old. I worked at McDonald's at Egerton and Hamilton Street in London, Ontario. It's at the corner there. And I was making like $6.40 an hour, I think was my starting wage. And one of the first things that I wanted to do, because I was, a nerd and I was into gaming and all that kind of stuff, is that, I built my first computer, and it was a water-cooled computer so that I could like overclock it and do all kinds of cool stuff with that. But I've always just kind of had this mentality, if I wanted something, I had to go out and get it myself. Now, from an early age, I was told like, oh, if you want to be successful in life, you've got to, get a degree or, get a diploma, and, then you get a good job, and then you get a family or get a wife, get a family, and that's how life goes. So I applied to university. I got accepted into mechanical engineering at UWO. That's the university in London. And I just even remember thinking, like, why am I doing this? Right? Like, why am I here? Because especially in the second year, so I did pass my first year, not with flying colors or anything like that. My average was stupidly low compared to, what I was used to. But in my second year, I just really got extremely exhausted and tired of doing problems in my head all the time, working on calculus and algebra and things that I'm I was just very frustrated because I'm like, I just don't want to do this stuff, right? I wanted to, get out into the world and actually do things with my hands. So that kind of makes sense in terms of, all this construction and stuff. I'm like, I don't like being in my head thinking about things all the time. I want to be out there actually building things. After my second year, during my second year, that is when I dropped out. So I'm a university dropout, proud of it. And, I kind of felt like at that time, I felt like I was fucked up, right? In terms of like, I wasn't fulfilling what I should be doing. And so at the age of 18, I went into a massive tailspin of depression. I didn't have any outlook on life. I didn't know what I was going to be doing or where I was going to be going. So I went into a very serious bout of depression. And it was definitely an interesting time for me because it was, very difficult. I was very unmotivated to do anything. Getting out of bed and taking a shower was like an accomplishment for the day. I was suicidal at some points, to the point where I even typed into Google. It's like, how do I kill myself? Right? Like it was a deep and dark time. And, I could tell that my parents were certainly worried about me. So I ended up like getting a job working at a mall, at a clothing store. And that's actually about the same time when I became an electrician. So I really wanted to like get out there and work. So I think that is when I was 20. And so that's when I started my apprenticeship at 20, and I quit that when I was 25. So it's just about 4.5 years that I was actually working as an electrician. Now that's obviously an amazing base of knowledge in terms of construction. And it was the only job that I actually enjoyed. The only time where I was just like, man, like I actually enjoy going to work and doing something, because at the end of the day, I could look back and see what I accomplished. I was working in new places all the time. I did a lot of Domino's, Papa John pizza shops. I worked in churches, did a bunch of new homes. I was working in different commercial facilities, industrial facilities, and I was just kind of going through the motions. And it was at that time when I was 24, 25 that's when I first learned about being plant-based. I had really bad, severe cystic acne, and I was going the typical medical route and doing that. And it was just like not really helping and not really working. I was getting really bad side effects. And so then, I looked for alternative ways. And so then I, looked at being, vegan and plant-based and eating, a mostly raw diet, because I wanted to find a better way of, I guess, healing my body. And at first it was just superficial. I'm like, I have really, really bad acne. Let's try to get this stuff figured out, because socially growing up, it was definitely a very difficult time, right? Just having, big breakouts and zits all over your face. And, it definitely set me back socially, because I was definitely more of a hermit. I always kind of wanted to be by myself and not really show my face and kind of be out in society. So that was really kind of the start. So when I was 25, that was towards the end of being an electrician, and I was vegan and plant-based. And then I was also learning about different styles of building, like earthships and stuff. And this is when YouTube was a lot newer. And so there wasn't nearly as many resources and as many videos as there is right now. But I was just inspired by it. And I had a lot of time to think about it. And, I was just like, there's just so much more to life. And I'm like, am I going to be satisfied with my life if I'm an electrician for the rest of it? And I was like, no, this is not something not that I didn't like it, but I knew that I had more to offer the world. And there's things that I was far more interested in, learning about solar, and obviously as an electrician, that's always interesting. And, these different alternative building styles, I was just like really fascinated by it. And so I knew that was something that I wanted to definitely pursue in my life, and having that construction knowledge was incredibly useful. So I was into all different types of some bad habits and stuff, going to raves and, doing ecstasy and MDMA in my early 20s. Not that they were bad habits, that I was doing drugs or something like that. It was just kind of more the crowd and the people that I was hanging out with. And I'm like, I just didn't really kind of jive with it. So at 25, I decided, all right, I'm going to basically quit my career as an electrician. I'm going to move to the west coast of Canada in British Columbia, which is a little bit more kind of progressive thinking, people that are a little bit more interested in nature. And I just wanted a new, fresh start. So I basically sold everything that I had, and I drove across the country, not really with a good plan or a good, bounty of money or anything like that, to basically start a new life. And it was obviously a little scary and intimidating, and because I didn't know what was happening or what would happen. But I also had been reading success books, and, even like Think and Grow Rich I'd read before that, and different books about how to think. And I was just, I didn't really have like a big goal or a big plan. I'm like, I just want to start fresh. And so the only thing that I knew that I wanted to do at that time, I'm like, I just want to live in a cool place. And I had friends and people that I'd met that were living there, and they talked very positively about it. So I'm like, that's what I'm going to do. So I sold everything, moved across the country with everything that would fit in my car at that time. I had a bamboo bike strapped to the roof. I'll show some photos and videos throughout this video to kind of share some of those things, kind of going back in time. But all I knew was that I had a place to stay for 2 weeks. That was it, with some friends that I had met. Immediately as I got there, I'm like, all right, what am I going to do? So the people that I was staying with, Tara and Ryan, Tara mentioned to me, she's like, have you ever looked into house sitting? And I'm like, I didn't even know what house sitting was, right? So you basically just stay in someone's house while they're traveling or on vacation or something like that. And you're just taking care of the house, looking after their pets. And the deal is that you get to stay there for free. So I found a house sit within like a week, and I was able to stay in Campbell River, British Columbia for 6 or 7 months, completely rent-free. So I only had to pay for food and all that kind of stuff. I didn't have a lot of money. I think I only had just over like $1,000 to my name. But it was actually during that time that I started YouTube. So that was back in, it would have been 2011 or something like that. I think November or December of 2011. And that's when I started my first YouTube channel called Unconventional Living. And that was really just to document the bike tours and to kind of show an alternative way of living and to talk about being plant-based, being minimal. So when I started these bike tours, the only things that I owned in my life fit on my bike. That was it. I had a box of clothing at home for some dress clothes. If I had to come back for a funeral or something like that, that's all I had was a box of dress clothes, and everything else that I owned had to fit on my bike. And that was my rule. So I started a bike tour and started documenting it on YouTube. And that would have been in early 2012. And I didn't even really know exactly why I was doing it. I just knew that it was just something that kind of spoke to me. And it was just something that I wanted to do. I'm like, this sounds pretty badass, so let's do that. So I started in Ho Chi Minh City in Hanoi in Vietnam, and rode my way down to, not Ho Chi Minh. I started in Hanoi and then I rode down to Ho Chi Minh City. So I rode the entire length of Vietnam on my bike, just me and my bike, and everything that I owned at that time. I learned a lot. Even during that first leg of the bike tour, I kept going after that. But just kind of like the interesting things of life, I was witness to, poverty. I'd never seen poverty really in my life. I would say Cambodia is definitely a little bit more low in terms of poverty. But I was riding and, having this experience where I'm in a completely foreign country. I don't speak any of the local language. I'm a foreigner, and, here I go. I'm doing this. And it was, the first time that I really kind of stepped out of my comfort zone immensely. Moving across the country, that was certainly stepping out of my comfort zone. But starting a bike tour in Southeast Asia was stepping out of my comfort zone. I left Hanoi not knowing where I was going to sleep, because my plan was, and I was very naive and not necessarily thinking things through because I didn't have any experience doing it. But I'm like, I'm just going to find places to camp. And so I did stealth camping throughout most of Vietnam, and then after 2 or 3 days of that, finding a hotel, I didn't have a lot of money. So I think I went over to Vietnam with maybe $1,200, which doesn't sound like a lot, and it's not. And obviously that part of the world, you can live a lot more inexpensively than in North America here. But $1,200 was probably about 3 months worth of money. It wasn't, going to get me too far. Towards basically before I got to Ho Chi Minh City, I was probably about 2 or 3 days away, and I picked a bad spot to camp, and some locals went through my luggage while I was sleeping, took money, took my camera, took my laptop. They did leave me my passport, which was very good, very nice of them. They didn't take my wallet, like my bank cards and stuff. They didn't take my ID. But yeah, they took my camera. Actually, they left me a GoPro. Maybe they didn't see the GoPro, but they left me a GoPro and took everything else. And I experienced anger and just being totally like, what the fuck am I going to do kind of moment. So I ended up making it to Ho Chi Minh City, stayed there for a couple weeks, and finally kind of got my bearings. And I was still documenting this on YouTube and, trying to make videos without a laptop. So I'd go to internet cafes and edit videos on there, just with my GoPro footage. It was interesting. When I was staying in Ho Chi Minh, some guy was riding his bike from China. He didn't speak any English, but he had shown me how many kilometers that he had ridden, and that he was on this incredible bike tour himself. And so even though we couldn't communicate with each other, it totally inspired me to keep going. And I'm like, all right, well, my goal was to get to Bangkok, Thailand. I'm like, I'm going to keep going. So I got back on my bike. I rode through Cambodia, through Phnom Penh, stayed in Angkor Wat for a little bit. And it was actually during that time, and because I was posting on social media, at the end of it, like I'd mentioned in the videos that I wanted to go to Australia. So actually somebody from Brisbane, Australia reached out to me while I was in a place where I'm like, I have no idea what's going to happen. No idea. How am I even going to afford going to another country? Like a lot of like thoughts like that. And so they reached out, and the guy told me, he's like, hey, I've got a place here. You can stay at this place, and I can also get you a job working as a waiter for the catering company that he was a manager at. And I was like, amazing, right? Like, even though I have no idea who this person is, it was just blind faith, right? Just like, all right, this is really my only option at this point. So I ended up making it to Bangkok. I had no money. I think I borrowed $500 from my brother just to be able to afford a flight to go to Brisbane, get my visa and basically start going in Australia. So I was in Australia for just a year. I stayed in Brisbane for about 3.5-4 months working at this catering company, being a waiter, and made enough money to buy a new laptop, new cameras, and then I continued on. So I rode from Brisbane down to Sydney, through Melbourne, up into Adelaide. And then I stayed in Adelaide for 3 or 4 months. And then I was like, oh, well, I want to go somewhere else. I knew a lot of people in Cairns, Australia, and I forget the province or state that it's called, Queensland, North Queensland. And so then I stayed there for about 3 or 4 months. I was selling tire tube wallets to help make money. I was very, very frugal living. Like I said, everything that fit on my bike was what I owned, and just kind of doing this weird kind of traveling bike tour journey. Staying there, once I got my tax return back from working at the catering company, it was like over $2,000 or $2,500. And I was like, sweet, I've got so much money now. So I bought a ticket. I went to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and then rode my bike from Kuala Lumpur all the way up to Chiang Mai. Now, that was kind of the end of doing those major bike tours. So I did 3 major bike tours, totaling probably around 8,000 to 9,000 kilometers. When I was in Australia, I strictly stealth camped because the population density is so low. I could just sleep in, national forests and just random places. I never actually paid for any accommodations when I was bike touring in Australia. So never paid for a camping site, always just found a place to camp. And, one idea that I always had in my mind there is that if I step off the cliff or jump off a cliff, so to speak, I had faith and belief that there was going to be a net down there to catch me. And that's all I had. I just strictly faith that this is all going to work out, and just kind of following my bliss. I'm like, I enjoyed doing the bike touring and getting out there and, just being with myself and seeing parts of the world that most people have never seen. I think I've seen more of Australia than most Australians. I was able to ride down the Great Ocean Road and see the 12 Apostles. And, I even remember one night when I was camping out in a forest somewhere, I was just sitting there, and it was right before the sun sets. So I always found a camping spot in that little window of time that you have as the sun's starting to set. And I was just sitting there just kind of thinking and doing whatever. And then this little baby kangaroo just like hopped on by, and it was probably no more than 10 or 12 feet away from me. And I was just like, wow, like I'm in nature. I'm like, how many people really actually get to see things like this and to experience things like this? So I was back in Southeast Asia. I spent, a couple months in Thailand. I probably spent a total of 6 months total in Southeast Asia, a year in Australia, and just going on this journey, right? And, I knew I wanted to go back to Canada. I didn't really, I'm starting to run out of money. I didn't have a way to make money. I was making some money on YouTube, but I think it wasn't until I got to Adelaide that I made my first $100 on YouTube. So that had been, I'd been posting videos for, some time, right? And it takes time to hit that $100 threshold. And so I didn't really have a lot of money. I wasn't really, I still had the entrepreneurial mind. Like I was making tire tube wallets, and some of you that are watching this may even still have it. I still have a couple that I made, back in the day. But then I was like, all right, let's go back to Canada. I want to go back to British Columbia. So I ended up staying with my buddy Ted Carr in his house, in his basement, in the living room basement. I slept on the floor, and, I stayed there for probably about 3 or 4 months and still didn't really kind of know what I was doing. I'd actually met a girl at that point, not Hannah, and I was dating her for a bit, but she was in the States. So that obviously long distance didn't make things like easy or anything like that. I stayed in Chicago for a little bit to be with her. And then I ended up moving back to my parents' place because I was like out of money, no prospects, no nothing, back to my parents' place. And I was just like, I remember even thinking when I got back to my parents' place, I'm like, I have seen incredible things. I've traveled all around the world. And it's like, I'm back at step one, so to speak, living in my parents' basement, right? So soon after I got home, I'm like, I got to find a job, right? I got to start making some money. So I got a job at the local grocery store. And I'd had previous, jobs, like when I lived I lived technically in Coquitlam, but if you don't know, that's like kind of like one of the suburbs of Vancouver. I worked at a grocery store there. Even though, university dropout, smart guy, working at minimum wage jobs because that's all that I knew, right? That's all that I knew how to do. And I still had like little entrepreneurial side gigs and stuff like that, but I wasn't making a lot of money, just enough to kind of survive. So I got home, living with my parents, got a job at the grocery store working overnights. And that was the most miserable time of my life. And if anyone has worked overnights, I feel you. If you're working them right now, I feel you. It really fucks with your sleep schedule. It just fucks with your life in general. And it's just not natural and normal for humans to be working during the nighttime. But I had to do something, right? Fortunately, after working there for a few months and doing that, just that desire and drive to want to do greater things in my life was very apparent to me. I was thinking like, man, I'm just back at my parents' place. And at this point, I'd started studying more in depth into success material and Bob Proctor's material. And so that's one reason why I've always referenced it in previous videos that I've done. And, even podcasts that I've done with Hannah is like just this idea that you can create the life that you want. You can be abundant in health, wealth, relationships. You can really literally design your life how you want it. And since I had nothing going on, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have this overarching goal in my life. I'm like, I'm going to trust and have faith in whatever Bob says. And I'm going to do whatever Bob says. So Bob Proctor is a success teacher. He's been doing it since like the 70s or 80s. Like he's OG in that regard, right? An OG. And he had this program called You Were Born Rich. And I think it was free on YouTube at that point, or they're just like streamed, or they're just kind of illegally uploaded. But I just watched it religiously. I'm just like every morning, every day, I'm like, I'm going to watch at least 30 to 60 minutes of this. And then in the evenings, when I'm not working, I'm like, just watch it. And so I started to learn that my life and how I was living, very impoverished, relatively speaking, I was just kind of flabbergasted that, or just maybe I was just more annoyed and kind of upset that I was taught the wrong things growing up. I was not taught how to create a life. I was taught to follow the plan. You do this, you do that, you do this, you do that. Then you're successful. Then you're happy and you make money, you get the house and shit like that. Bob talks, what's so inspiring about Bob and his story is that he was not a smart guy growing up. He didn't even finish high school. He actually only did 2 weeks of high school. So going from primary school, or just like regular elementary school, which is grade 1 through 8 or K through 8 in Canada. We don't have junior school or things like, or middle school in Canada. So he didn't even finish grade 9. And he was able to figure it out through studying success material. And a lot of his lessons are so powerful that it's like, you can create the life that you want, right? You can create whatever you want. The things that you strongly desire and want the most, you can create. And so while I was studying this stuff, I was still inspired in a construction sense. And obviously with my history being an electrician, I'm like, I really want a tiny house, right? And this is where the tiny house journey started. I'd watch a documentary on it. The documentary is called Tiny. And I was just like, oh man, this is great. I can just build this house. I can take it wherever I go. And so I was planning on staying in Canada and doing that. After having an ex-girlfriend in America, I knew kind of like the situation of getting into the States and like trying to like move here was, it's a pain in the butt, right? Like I did not want to move to the United States. I loved Canada. I'm like, I want to stay there. I'm like, I should build this tiny house where I am, and in London. And then I was just planning on taking it out to the west coast of Canada. Sometimes when you create a vision for yourself and you create the life, you're only focused on the end result. So I knew I wanted a tiny house that I built myself, living with my dream girl on an off-grid property. That's all that I knew. So that is when I was still working at the grocery store. It's the Real Canadian Superstore on Oxford and Gamage in London, Ontario. If you live in London or you've been there, then I used to work there. Fortunately for me, when I started doing this, I also started like I love myself practice. I kind of noticed that I had a lot of negative thoughts towards myself. So I started repeating the mantra in my head over and over and over again when I was working at the grocery store, because I was just doing, dumb stuff. And actually I got not promoted, but I changed departments, and I was actually working in the bakery because I could work normal hours and I didn't have to work overnight. So when I was working, I remember just, having the vision for my life. Like, I want to live in this off-grid tiny house with my dream girl. And I was just like thinking about it incessantly. I'm like, this is what I want. And it wasn't soon after. We're talking like a couple weeks of doing this and studying the material and watching the videos and really having faith in it, right? That this is the life that I wanted for myself. Now, previously, I had actually talked to Hannah. She was going through some drama and controversy online, so I actually reached out because I was a YouTuber as well. I think at that time I had like probably like 25,000 subscribers on my original channel. And actually it was probably closer to 30,000, I think. And so I had reached out to her because she was in the plant-based and vegan scene. That's, one thing that I was talking about quite a bit. And, I just reached out and talked to her. We talked on Skype a couple times. There was no like attraction from like a relationship standpoint. It was strictly platonic. We're just, friends reaching out, talking about our dramas and controversies together. And that's all it was. And that was probably, maybe a few months prior to this point in time. So after I'd been working in the bakery, I also I was very focused on designing my life. I'm like, what do I want? So I thought about the type of person that I wanted to be with, and I made a list. I made a list of, everything that I wanted, how she looked. Like, I went into as much detail as made sense. And so I was visualizing that, thinking about the tiny house. And then just out of the blue, I was like, because I was single at the time too now, because I'd broken up. My ex and I had broken up. So I was just like, maybe I should just reach out to Hannah. right? Maybe I should just reach out to her and just, see what's going on in her life, because we had good rapport and we had good chats and stuff. And, I was kind of lonely. So I'm like, I'll just reach out to her. Right. And we started talking, and things started to, I was talking to her about like tiny houses and alternative styles of living and, the things that I was, studying from Bob. And I was talking to her about a lot of that kind of stuff. And I even told her, I'm like, because she was single at the time as well, I'm like, you should make a list of the qualities and what you want in a relationship, right? Funny thing is, probably 2, 3, 4 weeks later, after, we had started connecting and having more frequent Skype calls, we had both realized that the person that we wanted, that we had both written down, because she had done it, I had done it. And I was reading the list and I'm like, this is Hannah, right? I was like, this is wild how this is happening. And this was only a few weeks after I started doing this. This wasn't like years afterwards or months afterwards. This was a few weeks. So I had this intense realization. I'm like, wow, this is working. Like what I'm doing, the study, the visualization, it's working, because I'm like, this is the dream girl that I wanted. And she was totally down for, building a tiny house and all that kind of stuff. And it was profound, right? Profound point in my life. And so then I ended up traveling. After we'd been talking for about 3 or 4 months, I traveled down to Minnesota, where she was living, visited her for a week, and had a great time. And, it was even that was actually because she had been doing YouTube for a while now as well. And I think she had like 20,000 subscribers. When I first met Hannah, I had more subscribers than her. Now that is not the case. But when we first met, I had more. And I told her, because I had actually tried writing a recipe book myself and promoting it through my YouTube channel, because I'm always, looking entrepreneurial minded, right? So I made my own recipe book and it did not sell very well. It kind of sucked. The photos sucked and the recipes were super basic, because that is not my thing. So when I met, or even when I was talking to Hannah, before I went and visited her, I'm like, you should really write a recipe book, because at that point she had already lost over 40 pounds eating a starch-based diet. There's also a lot of things that I just loved about Hannah, is that she says what's on her mind. She does not follow the path that everyone else is doing. She can stand up for herself. And there's just so many things that I just loved and respected about her when we initially met, and first connected with each other. And I told her, I'm like, yeah, you should write a recipe book. Not really thinking that much of it. And then when I visited her in March, she basically had the book done. And I was like, wow, like that's impressive. Like all photos, she had it she had it like the actual ebook kind of made in a program called Blurb, which if you're ever making an ebook or anything like that, do not use Blurb. It's the worst software and service for actually making a book, specifically an ebook. So we, at that point there, let's talk finances. I only had probably about $3,000 in the bank. Hannah at this point was $20,000 in like credit card debt. She owned a house, and she owned a Mercedes. So from the outset, from looking out, it looks like, oh, wow, like she's doing really well. She's got a nice car, a good job, and she's got her own place. The reality of the situation is I actually have more money than her. When you boil everything down, there's always this illusion, and debt creates this illusion. And this is why being debt-free is so important, is that you can create the illusion that you are successful. It's very easy to do so, because you don't need to have all the money up front. So you go into debt. So you can buy a big ass house and you can buy the nicest car. But guess what? Until you own it, the bank owns it. The bank will always own it until you make that final payment. If you don't make that final payment, the bank still owns it. Being debt-free is really important to having a life of freedom. So she was $20,000 in credit card debt. she was, financing her car. When we sold her car, we had to pay $6,000 to sell it. And when we sold her house, which I had to do a lot of work fixing it up and putting even some of my own money into it, I think we only made $3,000. So she was in technically $23,000 worth of debt when I met her, and I only had $3,000. So that's where we started. We started with one recipe book, and that was called Raw to Whenever. So that's the book that she was working on at home by herself. And I basically took the book from Blurb, and I'm like, because I had experience with Adobe InDesign, I took the book, put it in Adobe InDesign, created a PDF, created a sales page, and then we bundled it so you could buy her book, or you could bundle it and buy my book along with it. And that book was originally called Real Food, Real Simple. And I remember it was the first day that we launched it, right? And we were basically in a relationship and massively in love, and starting to think about our life together in the future, and making plans for getting a fiance visa and all that kind of stuff. And she was still in this massive amount of debt. I didn't know that she was in debt. I found out months and months, quite a long ways afterwards. She never told me. But we sold that book, and she only had maybe 20,000 subscribers at the time. And we made $700 the first day. And I was blown away. I was wow, this is incredible. I'm it would have taken me, 2 weeks to make that amount of money. We made that money in a day. And then I think the next day we made $400 or $500. We made $1,000 in 2 days. And we're just wow. Both of us were just blown away by it. It was kind of one of those times where it's I didn't even know that you could do this and make money. So when people they're always blown away by us, because they're so you guys pay for everything, all the stuff on your property and all that kind of stuff, that's all money coming from social media? And I'm yeah. So this is about 7 years ago. This was back in 2014. That's when we first kind of started a business together, I guess, right? That's essentially what it was. So we got obviously super inspired and motivated by it, and we kept working. So even because we had met, I think it was in March of 2015, I think somewhere around there. The dates it was March when I went down and visited her. And then, we wanted to be together. So then we, figured out we had to go through the entire process of getting me down in the States. There was no reason why she'd come to Canada. I had nothing there. And so we're all right, let's, figure this out and get me a visa so that I can come to the States. And the easiest way of doing it is through a fiance visa. Neither of us really wanted to get, married and do that traditional thing, but it was really the only way to get me to the States so that, we could, start our life together. So between March and November, we got married November 11th, 2015. It's actually coming up a couple days here. We had started working on another book, and starting to create a business, being apart from each other, and continually working on our YouTube and building this business, which we initially called it Raw to Whenever, and there's an entire story about that. But that's basically the start of High Carb Hannah, right? From the early days. So once we got married, and I think I came down in October, and then you have to get married within 90 days. So then we were married November the 11th. At that point, in 5 or 6 months, we were making more money doing High Carb Hannah than she was making at her job. So so she quit her job. We packed everything up. We sold her house, sold everything but her car, and we drove the car down to Tucson. And some of you will probably kind of know the story. So once we started living with each other, that's when I started this channel. It was called Life Inside a Box originally. Then it morphed into Handeeman. And it was a daily vlog channel. And, I posted over 220 daily vlogs in a row in just as many days. I was inspired by Casey Neistat. So I've got resentment towards doing daily vlogging because it's a pain in the ass to do, but that's what we did. So we moved down to Tucson. We're living there, saving money because we still had this dream of, building a tiny house and, starting this off-grid property together. And we were kind of going by the seat of our pants. I mean, we had a lot of faith in each other and a lot of faith that things were going to work out for us. And we, even from early on in our relationship, we're always into designing and creating our life, like even this property. Before we had even started looking for land, we knew what we wanted. We wanted, at least 5 acres. We wanted acreage. In the desert here, we really fell in love with Tucson. And actually somebody reached out on one of my videos, I think probably when I was building the tiny house, Bob and Karen, and they're like, oh, you should come down, check out our place. They live in this cool straw bale and cob house. And they're telling me about basically the how you can opt out of building inspections here in Cochise County. And I was like, oh, damn, that's where I want to live. Because, we wanted to build the tiny house, but we also knew that we were going to build a normal size house. This one right here. So we lived in Tucson for a year in that real low end apartment. We're super minimal. I mean, we're mainly focused on saving money. We're like, we need to save money. We didn't even have cell phone plans for a while. And then when we did get a cell phone plan so that we could, communicate with each other, for emergencies and stuff, we got $3 cell phone plans through T-Mobile. And so we're living as super minimally as possible and, focusing on putting all the money that we were earning, and we're still developing new products and new books in the apartment in Tucson there. That's where we made the Instant Pot book, shot video and did all the photos for that in there. And we're even working on a weight loss guide at that time as well. But we came out here, we did a carryback loan on this property, and, that was trying because, we didn't want to go into debt, but we knew we wanted this land. Once I stepped on it, I'm like, yeah, this is a spot, right? Just a really good feeling. And that's kind of the start of the story from there. And that's, a lot of you have seen, obviously, everything that we've done on this property since then. And, building the tiny house up, building the area around it with the fence and the water tanks and the rain roof, and then, building the garage and going through that journey. We wanted to obviously create financial abundance for ourselves, and we were very self-motivated in that regard, and, building a business that helped people, right? That was really our intention from creating content on social media, on YouTube here. It's always started from a base of wanting to help people, inspire people, wanting to help people to achieve greater things in their own life. And that's a really important way to start a business. You shouldn't really get into a business just because you think, oh, I'm going to make a lot of money. Yeah, you may make a lot of money. It may be successful in that way, but you have to start just with wanting to help people, right? It's really important. And through High Carb Hannah and through what we've done, so, we've helped thousands and tens of thousands of women and some men. It's mainly women, but there are some men in there as well. I see the emails and I see the orders, but it's primarily women, and we've helped so many women achieve more freedom with their body in terms of their weight. It's pretty common to hear, I lost 15 pounds, 30 pounds, 50 pounds, 60 pounds, 100 pounds. I've read a lot of the testimonials, and because I'm clear, like a very integral part of the business on the back end, I did all the stuff initially, everything. I built the website, built the sales funnel, created the lead magnet and the cheat sheet, and, really worked on the back end of things, where obviously Hannah was making videos and creating content and was like the face. A business like this, any kind of type of online business, it's like it's multifaceted. There's a lot of things going on. All of this was by design. When people say, oh, you got like an inheritance, and I'm like, no, we've just mainly focused on helping people. And yes, we are rewarded through, business should be a value exchange. It should be, you want to give people more value and help them out more than what you're getting in return. And that's always been the premise of what we wanted to do. That's why there's always so much free content and free advice and free stuff, because the more that you put out in that regard, in terms of value, it's going to reciprocate back to you. I'm not saying that we put out free stuff because we know it's going to like make us money. We put out free stuff because we want to help people, and we want to see people where they're at, and we want to get them going down this path of eating, plant-based and eating vegan for their health, for the environment, for the animals, all those great reasons. But that's how we really started. And that's where things really started to take off, when we were able to fully buy our land, right? And we had just invested so much money into the tiny house as well. I think it was like 35,000. So just from the get-go, we just set up this online business through wanting to help people, and we were rewarded for it because we were helping so many people. And her YouTube channel has been obviously growing exponentially. It's over 800,000 subscribers. This channel is now over 200,000 subscribers. And that's how we got to where we are now. And obviously our life is tremendously different from where we started. And everything has been by design. We wanted to create this. A lot of the lessons that, I've learned through Bob and through other mentors in my life, those things, those ideas are so ingrained into my head that I don't really think about it. I just do. I'm a conscious competent because I know what I did, but it's unconscious now. So the belief that I have in myself, the belief that Hannah has in herself, it is so ingrained with us because we spent so much time studying this material, reading books, even going to seminars to basically create this. One thing that I'd really recommend that you check out is that seminar by Bob Proctor. It's called You Were Born Rich. I'll leave a link to it down below. You can watch it for free on YouTube. Free content. But actually listen to it. Do what he says. Because it's through the doing and through the action, that's where the magic will happen. We can think about everything that we want and think about this and think about that. Oh, that would be really nice. Yeah, it would be really nice. But when you're visualizing and designing your life, you're acting from a standpoint that has already happened. I was living in this house, this amazing house that, I was able to do a lot of work on myself, which I'm very grateful for. And to be able to create the space with Hannah, we'd been creating the space in our heads long before it even started. We knew what we wanted. We knew the type of finishings. We knew the vibe of the house, the lighting, and like everything was thought of beforehand, right? We were designing it in our minds. And that's the same way that you design your life. Building a house is like building your life. It follows the exact same process, because when I started building this house, all I had was a set of blueprints. Just a set of blueprints. Those are not the blueprints, but you get what I'm saying. I only had a piece of paper, and I had an idea. I had an image of what the house would look like, because we had our architect do a 3D design. I'm like, I need a 3D design so I can go live in this space. And then here we are. We're living in this space. Every part of our life we've designed, every part of our life we've created through our faith and our desire to want to do it. We wanted to create this space. We wanted to build that tiny house initially. We realized probably about 6 months into it, probably not a great idea. We need something bigger. Creating that garage, right? Knowing that it was going to supply a ton of water for us. That's why the rainwater tank's right next to it. It's going to have solar panels on it relatively soon. You know, all of this was done by design. All of this was created. And it always reminds me of a saying that I think is very important, is that we overestimate what we can do in a year, but you underestimate what you can do in 5 or 10 years. It was just my 35th birthday, just over a week ago. And I left the nest at 25. And that's when I started, you know, that's when I say my life really started, because that's when I was living life on my own terms. And if you're feeling, especially this pandemic has been crazy time for the world, for everything. It's, I think a lot of people are starting to realize it's like, maybe the way that I'm living right now is not going to work. You know, land prices and land has been definitely bought up in this area. There's not a lot left. And I think that's because people are wanting to change. And I think it's a part of my duty to help you make that change and make that shift in your life. And it starts with knowing where we started, where we are right now. And you've got to be honest with yourself. Where are you right now in your life? Not like geographically, like I'm in Phoenix. No, like where are you at financially, relationally, relationship-wise, abundance-wise? How happy are you with your life? Be honest with yourself. You have to be honest with yourself about where you are, because you can never figure out where you need to go if you don't know where you are. Because you can always go east, right? You can always go east, but if you don't know your starting point and your ending point, you're just going to keep going east or going west or going north or south, right? You got to know where you are and be honest about it. You know, I had to be honest with myself. I'm like, all right, I'm living in my parents' basement. I'm at a minimum wage job, even though I know I'm smart, intellectual, and I can figure these things out. This is where I am. And I'm like, I need to create and have a more meaningful life, you know, build a meaningful life. It's built the same way that you build a house. It's the same process. It starts up here. It starts up in your mind, and you have to visualize. And through visualization, through constant repetition of success material and constant repetition of visualizing what you want, you will start to take upon new actions. You will start to do different things and behave in different ways. And then you can go forth. All right, this video got a little bit longer than I thought, but if you've watched to the end, I hope you got something from it. And I'm going to be posting a lot more content like this because it's got to be out there, and it's all curated to help. I want to help. And I love hearing success stories. I love hearing people creating a new and better life for themselves. All right. I think that's enough for this video. Awesome, guys. Thanks so much for watching. The house tour will be coming up, and I'll show you the beauty of this space. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Talk to you soon. Peace.